It's not live at the URL, but it's recording, so.
Oh, okay. So today we have we're going to talk about rich snippets and schema markup. Well, actually structured data, but that's mostly schema anyhow. You can use other kinds like RDFA, etc. So to introduce Bill, tell us a bit about yourself.
Hi, I'm Bill Slosky. I'm the author at SEO by the Sea and the director of SEO research at GoFish Digital. So Google first got into rich snippets and rich content with a blog post in 2009 from Ramanathan Guha about the subject, where he introduced the idea of Google showing additional information in search results that were influenced by adding structured data to pages on your website. In 2011, Schema was born as a collaborative effort from a number of search engines. It wasn't a standard. It was something that the search engines got together and decided to come out with, sort of like they did with XML sitemaps a few years earlier. And Google often publishes information about Schema and what they accept, what they look for on their developer pages. So if you want to see how Google might be doing something a little bit different than Schema does, you look to Google developer pages, and they often write up those. There's also a Schema mailing list from the W3C, which I recommend highly, because you can see Schema being made and discussed, and they often ask for feedback on that mailing list, and it's additional maybe 30 or 40 new emails a month, which I'd recommend looking at. So Martha and Mark both provide a Schema app, which is a useful way of providing schema on your web pages. And there are a lot of details about using schema that aren't necessarily in a manual that's free to the world, and they offer a lot of information on their web pages, which is really helpful. And so we thought they'd be good people to talk to and tell us more about Schema and about Schema app. So welcome, Martha and Mark.
Thanks.
Nice to be here.
Well, it's good to have you here. And one thing we were talking about before we started the show was that Mark is a marketing ontologist, which is a title that you don't often hear too much in the SEO world. So it's more rooted in the semantic web world, which Mark tells us he has his roots in.
Yeah, that's right. So an ontologist is kind of looking at like what exists in the world, and in computer science, it's usually talking about the modeling or the concept model for a business or for like an area of research, and it can really be applied to lots of things. And Schema.org is one of those models that kind of like allows you to structure the content on your web content. And so I've kind of started as an ontologist, and I kind of like was presented with an opportunity when we were doing a bit of work sort of as an agency early on in the Google's history of rich results and Schema.org recommendations, that I was like, you know what, I know how to like do things and build tools and look at the Schema.org vocabulary as a sort of an ontologist first. So that's where I come from originally, and yeah, it's really fun actually to see such broad adoption and scale with this.
So Schema is machine readable content that can be added to a web page in a few different ways. There's a few different types of markup that can be used. Schema is considered the vocabulary. So what can you tell us about this markup?
Sure. I'm Martha. I'm the CEO here at Schema App, and I was really pulled into this whole semantic search entity schema world as a result of being married to Mark. And but what's super fun is that I grew up at Cisco, and I say like a strategist. I like to kind of take information and connect them together and summarize it. And so what I think is so interesting is that when you talk about schema markup, I often say it's like the language of search engines, right? So it's this common vocabulary that then allows it to be machine readable. But you can think of search engines as one machine, right? But it also is like other machines. So it could be, it could be a chat bot, it could be an on-site search, it could be, a voice assistant, right? Like all the things that we're saying, they're all just trying to understand, comprehend, translate, and then sort of infer. And I think that's like a really big piece, that inferencing, and where schema really plays an important role. And so I guess if you think about sort of schema markup as, that way to translate your content, then you can also think of the rich results of like, not only do I need to know what's understood by the search engines, but also where do I want to stand out? And so when we talk about schema markup strategy, we're trying to really combine those two things together. We're trying to think of not just like what you want to show up in pretty pictures, because it's great if, like, let's say you're getting FAQs for all your pages, but you actually want to know like the FAQs about a product, or the FAQs talking about your business, or about your reopening strategy for a medical clinic because like COVID's happening. And so we really see the semantics of schema markup and sort of, talking about the entity of the page. Like, I know things, Bill, you and Terry talk about all the time, is actually like the basis of this. And so we often joke that, philosophers are really great at schema markup because like the first question they're going to ask is, what is this thing, right? Like, what is this thing we're trying to talk about?
I enjoy the fact that schema is often either focused upon some type of action or some type of topic. Like you have speakable schema. As you're saying, it's machine readable specifically for speaker type devices. And it tells them what to provide as an answer to something. And when Google first introduced it, they introduced it a year before Schema actually approved of it, and they limited it to news websites. And they only allowed speakable to be used on sites that were in Google News. And it was intended to be used for more than just news. So schema tends to evolve and grow. And
absolutely.
It's one of the fastest. I recommend people use a mailing list because they can see when new versions come out, and new versions have been coming out of Schema every 2 months or so recently.
Yeah, we're seeing it for sure accelerate. Like before now, like we've been like doing schema, like I'll say a lot since about 2014 was when we first built Schema app, and we built it for our own use. And then in 2015, we really shifted our business from doing services to just focus on the product and sort of growing it. But it's really been in like 2019, 2020, where everyone else in the world started to care because they've seen it accelerate. And it's really only been since 2020 that we've started to see it, like, again, releases happen more frequently. We also have seen Google use schema markup, specifically for COVID, to actually bring information out. So like they're using it as a pretty agile tool to help them accelerate getting information to people in the right way quickly, right? And I think that's the part that's kind of exciting, is that like they're indeed using it in lots of different ways to engage users, right? Which is, again, the whole intent behind this is like Google wants people to stay on the web page so they can make more money from ads, and that's again where if you use it strategically, you also have to think about like that give and take, right? Which is that piece. But absolutely, it's accelerating, and it's exciting.
So, what type of sites use Schema app? Who are your typical customers?
So we work with all different sizes sites, and part of this comes from our history, right? So when we first started, our first tool was a schema app editor. It's excellent for doing markup on page by page basis. So that's really great if you're working on like a local business site or on a smaller organization. You can mark up to 20 pages probably without it like being hard to maintain. And we generate all the schema markup as well, so it makes that easy. But where we've been going over the last couple of years is really getting into more that complex schema markup. So I'll say like we've been moving to like work with mid to large organizations. So if you look at our homepage, we work with everyone from SAP on their global sites to some Canadian companies, Pizza and Home Hardware, Terry, for those of us that are in Canada listening, Keen Footwear for those in the Portland area or outdoorsy. So like really broad range. But I think part of it is like so many solutions out there are very like, this is what you get. Like you get a WordPress plugin and therefore you're just going to get articles or web page markup. We can talk about that. But if you actually want to have, actually when we met with Guha at Google, he was like, you guys are the scalpel. Like you can, we loved that description. He's like, you can do anything with Schema app. And so part of that is like, we work with sites that, any platform, anything, all enterprise platforms we work with really well, any type of content, we use the whole vocabulary, everything impending. So if you're an innovator and want sort of to have that scalpel, that's really where Schema app plays. So we like complicated, right? Like we're really good at that. So, and we want to work with people who want to see this as a really core strategy and want to sort of help us work with their content team, want to help us like think strategically about how they talk about those topics or those actions, and not just like be very tactical about going after rich results.
Might I jump in and add a quick point? So, Bill, you're mentioning how like the mailing group is a great source for like kind of getting information kind of early to the press, and there's some like I find the GitHub a repository for the schema.org group is also like it's almost like separate conversations are happening there, but there's a lot of activity and suggestions, and sometimes you'll find some gems in the GitHub repository where like the code is there. They have the issues listed for new proposals, and sometimes if you can look out for some of the Google staff, you'll find things like shipping kind of model that's coming out, or like shipping options, and which was pretty recent, and other things like discount offers, or like things that they're like just exploring as features. So if you want to be really early to figure out what's going on, like as a Google initiative, like there's some clues in the GitHub world and the GitHub issues for the schema.org vocabulary.
I love that people from Google do participate in the mailing list, and you can talk to them and ask them questions. You've got Dan Brickley, Ramanathan Guha, Richard Wallace, and you can say
all the crew.
Yeah.
It's like the I say like the Google crew who's really passionate about this stuff, right? Yeah, I think the part that's really interesting is we found, gems, you call them, but like, where Google's making specific recommendations, right? And I sometimes, argue that they're perhaps not argument. They're not they're not recommendations. They're direction. And so if you spend the time looking at it, you can at least get a sense of direction. And so again, that's something that we're really familiar at and that we dig into to kind of try to see like where things are going, so we can anticipate that with our customers.
And you see some of the people from the older semantic web, like Morton Hemp, participate in those discussions.
Yeah, for sure. He was on the original committee, right? For not original, but he was on like sort of the approval committee for that and for the vocabulary, and all of his stuff around the product ontology. Was like formed the foundation for all the schema.org terms on product and product models and
a lot of his good relations.
Work. Exactly. Sorry, the good relations is the vocabulary, and the product ontology was sort of the kind of glue between that and Wikipedia, essentially. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Bill, I think one of the interesting topics that comes up often is sort of that piece around, understanding, right? Like schema for understanding and semantics and inferring versus just like rich results. And I think especially as we talk about entity hour, right? As we sort of dig into that piece of it, it's where like I really love some of your work into the patents that starts talking about, I'll say like the future stuff they're talking about that we're now seeing come out, Bill, right? I was having a laugh. I was like, man, Bill and I talked about this 2 years ago, and now it's actually like here. But like how does this work with BERT and natural language processing, and how does this play to sort of the passages work and the feature snippets and everything else that they're doing? So much of this is underlaying of like how do they understand context. I'd love us to, I don't know, like Mark, you talk a lot about like relationships and sort of using schemas, like defining how things are related to one another and how that plays into this, basically giant ontology that Google has. But to me, that's like so fascinating because so much is coming down the pipe right now that is showing evidence that indeed schema is helping this and supporting it. I don't know. I'd love, Billy, your thoughts on that, and then also Mark's.
I was intrigued by the concept of Google collecting entity information long before there was a schema, recognizing that when they were collecting information about local business entities or local search, they were looking for specific formats for things like postal addresses. Like you had to put your address for your business in a postal code format for Google to catch it correctly. If you weren't using that format, Google didn't understand where you were at. So before there was a schema, there was an attempt to use data wrappers on the web. So schema is the chance to make sure that Google gets the information correct. If it's machine readable, they're the audience for that. And you're breaking things down to key value pairs. So you're saying these are the facts that appear in this bag of words on this web page in a way that defines it for you. It makes information more precise, which is definitely one of the values of using schema.
For sure.
Yeah, I like to think of like there's the primary use case of the Google search engine's results page features,
Yeah.
and but you can also see how the schema.org can be used in other places through some of the features around the rest of the Google kind of suite. So like the mail actions was an early one that they had allow you to use like the schema.org within an email to enable features of Gmail so that you can go to a certain page or accept the RSVP like within the context of the email. So that was been available for a while, but they keep adding, it seems, functionality into like the dynamic emails because you're encoding schema markup into an email, which is a totally different separate part of Google. But like they're using the same actions, like you had talked about, I think schedule action early on, and they have other actions like that are kind of defined in there. And then even like you'll see on web pages in your websites that you'll sometimes see a view action. So it's kind of like the deep link for an app. If you have an app that can also show the same content, it's held together in large part with the schema.org vocabulary to say like this can also be viewed in your app if you want to like go to that site. So sometimes you're prompted to go to one or the other, and so it's another place where like schema.org is kind of reaching into the app world as through using those actions. And then even like Google Home has a number of features that are that are like brought to their voice interface from the schema.org vocabulary. So like events, I think, and podcasts. There was 3 of them. I kind of forget at this point, but recipes actually was one. So as the crawler goes through your website, it's also allowing it to present in some of those other spaces, which is it's so fun to be able to like start asking Google some questions that could just have been informed from your website updates.
We recently did some tests on some of our clients who are using FAQ, and I'll say like some out there FAQs, and on the assistants that have a screen, we're actually seeing them refer directly to the FAQ schema markup, which is kind of interesting. You mentioned Speakable, Bill, and I often get asked on like, what are my thoughts on where Speakable is going to go? And I said, it was interesting because they announced it and they did it around news, right, like in media areas, and then the following year, it was about a year later that they announced like the FAQ and how to. It was like May at Google I/O. 2019.
Yeah.
And since then, like Speakable, like they haven't really talked about Speakable that much. And instead, like FAQs answering that question answer pair, right?
Yeah.
And then what's interesting, I think, where my brain goes next is around sort of the where we see like unfeatured snippets where when you click on it, they'll actually highlight the passage, right? Where they're finally that contextual answer. And now they're talking about passages, like as a way of sort of like, indexing passages on the pages to understand concepts, right? And context. And to me, it's like, they're all connected. And to go back to the Speakable piece, like part of me wonders, like, do they need Speakable anymore? Like, is that sort of become redundant? Because like, but now they're doing passages, which is like kind of these XPath snippets, which is like how Speakable was originally written. So we're like super, like, again, we're ready to do Speakable because like that's us at Schema App, like that's the way we work. However, like part of me is like, how do these things work together, right? Like how do they actually?
It doesn't hurt to ask them. I mean, when Danny Sullivan announced last year on Twitter in a tweet that top stories weren't going to be limited to news anymore, that they would show top stories from blog posts and from tweets and from other things, I asked him, does this mean Speakable will expand beyond news? Because
did he respond?
And he said, yeah, Speakable will be available through all different types of sites.
Oh, okay. Well, so that's a good answer.
Well, in Schema, Speakable isn't limited to news. It's and then Google came out and they introduced Speakable as a beta 9 months early, and they said only for Google News at this point. And they said you need to be actually a registered Google News site to have Speakable work for you. But if you are, you can use this. And tell us what the answers are to questions that you want spoken. So once he said that in Twitter, that opened it up. That meant it's available to more than just news sites, and it was approved in Schema as a pending Schema.
Absolutely, yeah, it's in the vocabulary.
Yeah.
One of the questions, I think, Mark, you had a good call out of like schema.org versus Google features, right? Sort of like what are the rules of the game in the schema.org world? I thought Mark actually had an interesting answer on that.
Yeah, well, like Schema is like way too flexible almost. Like they have almost no rules except like just following the properties that are related to a type, and otherwise it's a kind of a free for all. And like some of the rules, they're trying to make it. The intention is to make it really easy for publishers, and they put the burden a bit more onto the data consumer. So, for instance, it's quite a legit like way of putting in markup that anything can just be a text value or URL, and like that goes for any one of the properties, even though it's not explicitly saying it can be text or URL. It's just sort of part of the guidelines. So it's almost like too flexible, whereas like Google really shapes the kind of the entities and the way that the data needs to be presented so that they can have reliable data. So they'll put the constraints around that, but schema.org on its own has really no constraints.
So I have a bit of a philosophical question for both of you. Is the purpose behind Schema to train Google, to teach it how to think from subject matter experts, to understand products, to understand services?
Maybe. Like, we don't know, do we?
I mean, we have an attribute for one schema or many types of schema that's knows about. So you have a plumber who knows about drain repair. So you're teaching Google that plumbers do drain repair because it's a topic they know about.
Right.
So do you do that with other? It fits. It's usable with other professions. It's actually Schema is a way of allowing subject matter experts to teach search engine what a product is about.
Well, you're also modeling your own content and stuff, right? Like I think that's the part that, when we get into strategy with our customers or try to teach our agencies like how to do this, is that we're actually asking businesses to think how their business elements are connected and related to one another, and where they have data gaps as well. So it's and I like in 2017 I talked about like managing your brand for the machine channel, right? And your marketing data layer, right? And everyone thought I think I was a little crazy back then, and I could still present that same presentation now, and probably more people would listen and be interested because they're like, oh yeah, this makes total sense. And so to me, there's like, are you training Google? But I think what's also interesting is like, Mark kind of gave the example of like, I'll say like the ecosystem that is evolving, right? That needs to understand that data model. And like, I'll say like the strategist in me is like, that's what I'm excited about, right? Because like you help like let's use a giant company, right? Like, so think of, one of a Fortune 1000 company who is like really siloed. They've acquired businesses over the years. Like they don't have a holistic data layer of like how their information's all related. And so again, we're schema markup today, you're modeling it for Google to consume and understand and provide service, right? However, over time, that model can also provide service in lots of other ways, right? So, how are people going to get service from, SAP in 3 years, right? How are they going to want to interact? And, I sometimes even go as far as like, do you need a website? Like, or do you just need this like model, like this data model, or this like marketing data layer, or this knowledge graph, whatever you want to call it, right? In order to like present and be understood and interpreted, in order to then connect the dots to provide service. So, how Google's a consumer. I think where sometimes we have to focus on expanding is like, who else could consume this and accelerate, and where are those disruptions going to come that is going to make this, I'll say like both helpful and scary, because like right now I would say like over invested in Google using a lot of this stuff, and sort of where we all kind of use them as our primary service delivery, but like over time, who could use that, and how does it become an asset to us as business owners?
I think what's important is also like Schema.org provides a structure to your data, which is exactly what like machine learning algorithms need. So it's like, rather than trying to parse all the unstructured content in just the body of your content, if you're providing a Schema.org layer that already does the kind of the work from the publisher side, the consumers are getting this really rich kind of content set. And it's not just Google, like it's other crawlers are pulling it up. Like Bing has made some progress and over the last year or two as well with some of its JSON-LD support. But there's other ones, like even Facebook publishes some things like in their marketplace with product with Schema.org markup for products. So like you can see, they used to have also they still have Open Graph, which is a sort of another one of these sort of vocabularies. But there's a lot of overlap actually. Like you kind of do the mapping between the two. There's quite a bit of overlap that you can kind of think of, like an expression of one could go to the other. But like Pinterest, for example, also picks up JSON-LD to kind of like do rich pins as a feature, and so there's other consumers, and as we think of like opportunities, like there's other types of web experiences can use this structured data in different ways, like, to complement their data sets. That's the way we would think of it.
So sources of information like the knowledge graph are usable by others, not just Google. And I often see the word knowledge referred to in Google patents as relationships. Relationships between entities, relationships between entities and their attributes, between entities and their classifications. So when you're talking about how things are related to each other, you're talking about knowledge. You're talking about the knowledge graph. You're understanding those connections and how strong or weak they might be, what kind of confidence there might be in them. And Schema is sort of teaching the search engine about those levels of confidence, about those relationships, how strong or weak they are, what type of limitations they might have.
Oh, you get me so excited when you talk about this stuff. Yes. Well, and as where my brain goes is like people, like I'm like Bill, I think there's some practical examples, right, that we can share. So around like, you talked about knows about, right? Is sort of like an interesting relationship, right? Where you're sort of you're kind of getting into sort of like, I'll say like less contextual type of things, a non-tangible thing. I really like about as a really strong connector. And in fact, we're starting to do some stuff at scale where we can kind of link entities to topics within Schema at scale to Google's knowledge graph and Wikipedia and data, so we can make like really strong connections back to Google on like what these things are about. Mentions being like a softer relationship property, but again, sort of saying, like it's not totally about this, but it's mentioning these topics that sort of can then pull together, and these are again properties that aren't necessarily called out as required and recommended fields to explain the basics of perhaps like, an event or even an article, right? Like they don't even, however, when we talk about knowledge and we talk about sort of defining relationships are so important and so key and can really sort of, I would say, like take beyond just like hunting for rich results, going required and recommended, but really trying to make sure that you're also thinking about how you make content truly understood, right? And you can start, like I'll say, like baby steps towards, doing, I'll say, like more powerful connections and kind of knowledge graph mapping.
When we interviewed Dixon Jones from inlinks.net, he actually has done some research and found that there was some correlation, possibly not causation, that using about and mentions in the way you were discussing actually help pages rank better. At the very least, I think it helps Google better understand what a page is about, remove some of the confusion.
Yeah, absolutely. When Dixon and I did a podcast together, he didn't have hard evidence. I would say we're seeing some additional good news around that.
Yeah, I used his program to do a few pages and found it really helps.
It helps remove it helps disambiguate. It helps add preciseness. It helps define better how things are connected.
Yeah, and the work he does with extracting entities from the corpus and kind of giving you a score on those really helps in content development.
Yeah, and so we look at that same similar challenge, but doing it within the Schema at scale, sort of across different platforms, so that it really becomes like in part of your strategy and how you do things. And it's, I think like what's so fun is like, whether we're talking about inlinks or WordLift or like others where there's like the semantic world meeting the SEO world, right? Like they're all kind of coming together, and that's where I was laughing at Dave Ojita's retweet of this session where he was like, Mark's coming out of the back cave, like you're all going to hear from the founder of Schema app who, like came up with like, how you do this, not just like in one piece, but like, at scale and sort of, introducing these semantic principles. And I think what's, Bill, super exciting now is that like the words like entity and knowledge graphs and so forth are actually being used in context, like with proper definitions versus, even just a year and a half ago or 2 years ago, where there was just less of a community who was aware and thinking about, oh man, like this is actually how Google is working. And can we now not just like, look at that semantic core foundation and apply it sort of within how we write content, how we do things, et cetera.
Right. I went to an SEO conference in 2009. Somebody asked me, well, what's new in the SEO world? And I started talking about named entities and got blank looks and crickets.
I know. At least we like found some people to talk to things about, right? It's exciting time.
Now, Bill, I think you were an early attendee of the Semantic Technology and Business Conference. Yeah. And I had spoken to Aaron Bradley there, and he had mentioned you, and I don't think we connected at that time, but that was 8 years ago or something, 7, 8 years ago.
Yeah.
And that was kind of like my introduction to sort of the schema.org space was in that conference where I was coming from. I was trying to build something semantic technology, and then there was a few people from on a panel talking about schema.org, and I was like, oh, this is really interesting. and it's been, I can't believe it's only been 8 years at this point, but it's there's been a lot that's happened, right, since those early days.
We blame that conference for Schema app. So anyone ever wants to go, like, I actually like it's actually a fun story, right? So like I'm a sales storytelling person, right? So like Mark went to the conference, met Aaron Bradley, fellow Canadian. So we were like super proud. They were nerding out on semantic pieces. And at that time, I think it was like within the next year, Mark had created the first version of Schema app that we were using for the local businesses in Guelph. We used to joke that Guelph had the best semantic SEO ahead of everyone because we were sort of helping them do it. But when we sent it to Aaron to have a look, he's like, too bad Google doesn't support JSON LD yet, right? Which was what we were producing. And so no joke, like we kind of carried on, and we both worked in corporate. And so we were sort of, doing this entrepreneurial thing, kind of trying to figure it out. And then it wasn't until the following August, which I think was like the next conference, that JSON LD was supported. So this was summer of 2015. And no joke, we literally like, Mark attended the conference. We talked about it. Google announced that they would support JSON LD, and it was like September 12th, 2015, that we were just like, that's it. Like, we're just like, this is the part we're super excited and passionate about. It's actually like where we can make a biggest impact. And so we, like, no joke, Schema app was like born out of like those conferences, having those conversations, and then, Google finally like catching up to some of what we were thinking. So that conference, I think, has a huge impact on our lives, right? And changing sort of where we contribute and how we add value.
Yeah, it was mostly like the microdata and the JSON LD, and the RDFA is the third option, of course. But as a developer or like an app provider, we're trying to avoid getting into the templates because there's just too many hands in the pot. And it's like, well, JSON LD is a way to package this, and you can kind of inject it, but it was like a year too early for Google at that time. But so happy that they support it now, and microdata certainly has its places and certainly has its function, especially if you're in control of of your application stack. It makes perfect sense in lots of cases. But as a provider of service, like it's too messy to try to get in there with too many designers and developers and content people, like all trying to like muddle with HTML. Like, it's a little brittle. So that's why we're so happy to get JSON LD and go from there.
Yeah, I found RDFA very hard to implement. Took a lot more work thinking.
We don't have time to deal with that, right? Like, seriously.
I mean,
I still do a lot of my schema markup using tags, not JSON LD.
I'm sorry to hear that. I always joke that like, I always, again, the salesperson in me or the marketer is like, I got other things to do. I don't want to, because like if you don't, I joke with some people who are like, oh yeah, I can't want to keep writing it by hand. I was like, man, I have too many things I want to do in the world to like be writing my schema markup by hand. And I think part of it is like, so one of our goals is, right, like, how do you not lose out on any of the bells and whistles and complexity that you can do? So like nesting, relationships, defining between entities, making relationships, multi-type entities, like you name it, right? Like Schema does it all because like we're super nerds and want to be able to do it, right? So, we're good or bad, like we are the expert tool to do it. And if you want to just do basic stuff, like go find someone else. But if you want to actually like really semantically build it out and define things and connect things and reuse entities across like pieces, that's what we've really built Schema app for. Like we're a semantic technology company. Like that's at our root. And that's because, again, like we understand that that's what Google is. And we happen to have Mark, in the back room, sort of like being able to help build our team in order to do that. So I don't know, but I'm super excited about where we're seeing how Google's talking more about inferencing, natural language processing. I think what's perhaps interesting is how we're going to kind of see the evolution. And one of the things I wanted to highlight was around sort of the licensing. How like they have the new licensing feature for Google Images. And I found that so fascinating because like they're trying to show like how you can use images, which is kind of solving a user problem to know, like, can I copy this image and put it in my presentation, or do I need to like source it or so forth? But to me, it's also really interesting with the whole, I'll say, like, not in the last 6 months because the pandemic's been happening, but like the previous 2 years where like GDPR became like a really big thing, and being able to, how is the reuse of information being controlled, and what role does Google have in displaying that information that perhaps isn't theirs? And so I saw it as a really interesting feature for them to bring out that uses a built-in property called license, that's been built into schema.org that they're using now to, like, I'll say, help the user around licensing, but, could be used in lots of different ways as we start thinking about using schema as a way of, what are controls that the user then has on how it can be reused. So I thought that was really interesting, especially like with FAQ. And then again, this summer we saw like lots of changes with FAQ across different industries. But how that plays and like, what are we giving to Google or not? So I thought that was an interesting evolution that we've seen over this past year.
I think most people come across something like Creative Commons don't recognize that it's actually licensed. It's terms for reuse.
Yep, absolutely.
And it gets used frequently, but you don't necessarily see the ability to search for something that is available under different Creative Commons licenses. You can at places like Flickr. But there's a web full of images, and so many opportunities to share those and use those. I know Google's doing a lot of work analyzing what they see in images, so they're not actually violating copyright by looking at the images and learning from them. Understanding entities. There's a patent that talked about looking at photographs of bears in streams hunting fish, and they're telling you how they analyze bears as main entities of those images, fish as subject entities or secondary entities, and they learn about bears hunting frequently in streams for fish, and that's knowledge that they add to a knowledge graph that's not taken from words or knowledge base.
It's amazing.
Just from analyzing images on the web. And there's so many images to analyze, they can learn a lot from them.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, you reminded me, like, speaking of the commons, like the Data Commons project.
Yeah.
Which I'm just seeing what's new. Data Commons is now accessible on Google search. I guess there's some way in which you can kind of get access to it, but that's like bringing Google saying like some of the licensed data, they're putting it into this Data Commons open knowledge repository.
There was a Search On 2020 announcement that they're adding a new level to the knowledge graph, the Data Commons.
What was that? What was that announcement? Can you say that again?
Search On. Yeah.
Search On 2020. They're substitute for Dev.io this year.
Okay.
The half-hour presentation they gave that told us about passages and other features. Also mentioned Data Commons as a new level of knowledge graph, which is good to see.
What implications do you think that'll have, Bill?
I was thinking we're working our way towards an understanding of the cloud of data. We won't necessarily have to use Sparkle to query things.
Should we explain what Sparkle is so people know what that is?
I think we should.
Let's get Mark to answer that one since he loves Sparkle queries and I'm less of a fan. Over to you, Mark. What's a Sparkle query?
Do I have to say the acronym? Because I know there's a funny part of the acronym that it's like a Sparkle in the acronym, but it's basically the query language for graph databases. And RDF graph actually is opposed to a property graph because it has their own proprietary query language, but it's like SQL, the kind of from relational database worlds. It uses a lot of the same concepts of selects and wheres and orders and groups and that sort of thing. But it's a way to kind of like tie together a query for your knowledge graph. And so it's pretty fun. And I like the ideas that have like they'll say fun in that, like how you can tie together like different services. So that like they have this, you can do federated queries with it. So you can actually have initiate a query at one place and then have a query at other databases. So perhaps there's a data commons knowledge base that you want to actually query from your own data set, and you could bring that in to say like this is part of the kind of the corpus of content that you're looking at. And so it's interesting in some of the ways it works to kind of bring in other services.
Mark, since you mentioned services, I was wondering what your thoughts are if Google will ever include services as structured data.
Like in the rich results, you mean?
Yeah, or just support it, period.
I know, it's funny, right? Like why haven't they? It's there. I do like the service class or the data type in Schema.org because there's a lot of like interesting kind of fields in there. Like there's like service output, there's service type, there's like service channel. So there's a lot of things that might talk about how you're actually delivering the service or what's the outcome of the service that are not part of the product vocabulary. Right. And so that it kind of has its place. Whereas like, I don't know why they don't have a rich result for it or a feature for it. It kind of goes beyond me, but you can see some people doing work with like just like calling their service actually product to get the features, which it's sort of makes sense, but I don't know. Like a lot of times, if it's for sure a service, you don't often get price information. Like people don't often say like maybe if it's a kind of a more commodity kind of business, but like a consulting service or a legal service, you're not going to get a price. Which is like required field information for a product. So if you can get the product information that you can kind of see people, maybe this is what you're going towards, is you can get people sort of maybe overfitting in the product type as just to get the feature, which makes sense if the content's there. But I still like having the service kind of properties.
We debated this here, as you can imagine, because they've actually updated the schema.org definition for product to include service. And we kind of stumbled across this about 3 months ago. We actually covered it in one of our Schema app lives as multi-type entities, because now, like where before we were like super strong, like Mark just said, like use service schema markup. It's the right one. It's more specific. Because the definition of product in schema.org includes service, which by the way, like I should give them feedback that that's like not very specific, since they have a more, you should always use like the most specific type or class. And so like if it's a product, is it a product or a service? And if it's a service, then service should be a subclass of product, and it's not. So we've actually updated our recommendation to say do a multi-type entity, which means it's both a product and a service, because you can then use both. So if it does have a price range or offerings, which you can do in service provider, but you'll get the rich result then. So we've recently updated our how to do services schema markup to because of that specific, very, very small change in how schema.org has defined it. However, like I said, it should, service shouldn't be an ambiguous thing. It should be a subtype of product if that's how they're defining it. But
it's still though something that could be like a multi-type entity. Like how do you sell a hotel room in the schema vocabulary? You need a multi-type entity. So the concept is both a hotel room and a product, and so that way you can kind of get the feature. But like multi-type entities are a legitimate kind of concept to kind of get those intersections. So where you have a service that also has all the product information, you can go with the multi-type.
Right. And when you use multi-type, you get to use the properties from both. So
yeah,
there would be properties in service that would be really good at describing a product.
Yeah. So you don't have to like pick one or the other. If it's both, you can just use the kind of multi-type. Say,
it shouldn't be overused though, right?
Now with the hope that in the future, Google will support both, realizing as a multi-type, it's a good thing.
You just want to avoid the possibility of confusing Google, making it believe something ambiguous. Like at a website that was a 4-page long apartment website, and you could buy apartments. They had submitted the website to a directory that was for hotels, and it treated the apartments as hotel rooms. And it's like not the type of impression that you want Google to get. They're hotels, they're apartments. Don't confuse search engine.
Yeah, and also, but I also like I see. Let's talk about things you shouldn't do to disambiguate. Like one of my biggest pet peeves, Bill. You probably know this about me, but it's like don't put the same schema markup on every page. Like I hate plugins that put the same schema markup on every page, and I won't name them. You know who they are. But like if every page is an organization, then like what page is actually speaking about the organization? And then if the others are about topics written by an organization, then like define that relationship, right?
If
I
you're
can tell you why I did it as an SEO, because I wanted to associate the location with the topic.
Well,
If-
you can do that through other properties that define that
Well,
relationship.
I'm learning that now, but at the time it was in the footer on every page for that reason.
if you have pages that are specifically about people, you want to focus upon that entity type person
Yeah.
rather than the organization.
Absolutely.
Well,
Yeah.
I see now that it wasn't the best way, but it worked at the time.
Right.
Yeah.
I think there's a parallel with like content, like optimization. So like if you have 100 pages that are talking about the same thing, like in content, like this is duplicate content. You're supposed to get rid of 99 of them and have it focus on one page. And I think the same could be said about schema markup. If you're having the same schema markup on 100 pages, either put it in context of what's on the page or just make one page about it.
Right. It's not boilerplate.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Don't
Okay,
use boilerplate. Change it to the page so it's more
All right.
focused to the page.
So my other favorite pet peeve that I'd love Bill and Mark to comment on, because it's usually Martha making her statements on this, is let's talk about web page schema markup, shall we?
Okay.
So Martha's opinion is like, of course it's a freaking web page. It's on the web, right? Like we're talking about this like neurolinguistic understanding search engine, right? Like, can we please like accept the fact that it understands the web page? Like let's get to the next question of what is this thing, right? Which is Sarah then explaining topics and so forth. Bill, agree, disagree?
You have a site that's a medical site, or it's a cross medical legal consumer education site, and you're trying to decide what schema to use on which pages, and you look at the definitions for medical web page, and you look at the definitions for legal web page, and you're trying to choose one or the other, and sometimes you have to decide based on who wrote the content. And
those are two perfect examples of where it makes sense because of the reviewed by, right? Like where they're actually talking about the sort of like reference back to it.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great call out, Bill, that those are two where it does make absolute sense because you wanting to have the reviewed by and sort of be able to call that out. So I have seen that, like, again, medical webpage, I do like to then associate it to the topic. So if it's a medical condition and a medical webpage, so we can combine and get the reviewed of it and so forth. But yeah, I love that as a specific call out. It's great.
I'm kind of inclined to say like it's a shorthand because there's either not like there's maybe not a vocabulary to express the relationship between the actual entities on the page. So the web page ends up becoming this container that you're not really sure where else to put stuff. And like if you really want to talk specifically about something on the page, you should talk specifically about that first and foremost, and then other things are then like supporting your primary concept on the page. So I think Bill's example, maybe I didn't quite get it, but I kind of think of what that sounds like, almost a multi-type entity, and not necessarily watering it down by saying it's a web page. It's kind of like it's those two things. But perhaps like the details are always going to be interesting, because if you ask like 5 ontologists how to model something, you're going to get 5 different answers. So
just like SEO.
Yeah, like at least the benefit here, we have a hard vocabulary to work with. Whereas like if you just kind of want to come up with the model to begin with, that's where you get like a lot of variations in how you might approach it, and kind of the patterns in the schema vocabulary are different from like the gist ontology is like a very hard ontology and like how they do things, and it's like a different type of approach. So, but you can get there with multiple ways, but it's just sort of at some point an order of preference.
As a web developer, when I look at the web page schema, it also classifies parts of a site for Google, and they actually use that in their algorithm.
It's got some roots that go back to decisions information architectures have to make with navigation and classifying pages and assigning which navigation to use. And they often do that with approaches like card sorting, where they get a number of people, they give them cards to sort which things should go together. And often you end up with people with different lists of what goes with what. And you actually have to decide and make arguments for what goes where. So it's not always easy to define everything.
It's why it's
easy.
fun.
It's easy when Google says like do it this way, and then everyone's like, okay, that's the way the rules get all applied. But it's like the other like 85% of the vocabulary. I don't know. I'm kind of extending that a bit too far, probably. The other huge chunk of vocabulary that doesn't have a Google guideline still has some interpretation.
And you mentioned GitHub, Mark, which is sometimes a source of examples for use of schema. Because schema.org has some examples, but not as many as they probably could.
For sure.
It's a gap. It's an area that we've debated creating more of. We've got lots of examples. I think the piece that also, like the ambiguity, right? Especially, especially as we start thinking about like schema.org for like non-traditional businesses, right? So like local businesses, e-commerce businesses, like we do a lot of work with health systems or like hospitals and, B2B corporate businesses that like, it's a little more vague as to like what they're talking about and, how they're trying to pull people in and talk about really, I'll say like nefarious topics like ERP and so forth that can go. So I think like that's the part that I'll say like keeps your mind fresh, because as any business that we're looking at and talking to, it's, there's often elements of it that aren't as clean cut as to, Google saying to do it this way. And so I think that's where like both the debate and sort of the strategy piece becomes so much fun. And, it's an area that we've invested a lot in with our customer success and sort of like doing the professional services with our clients to make sure that they both understand and learn how to do that.
So schema was intended to be extendable. And there have been groups that have added extensions to schema. There's a financial institution business ontology schema. There's a schema from GS1 on e-commerce. There's an auto schema. So the
way it's done is funny though, right? Like, I'm sorry, I'll let you finish.
Okay, that sort of goes with my statement before about schema being used to train Google about topics, because your subject matter experts are the people who either create schema or use schema, and there are going to be lots of different uses. As Martha was saying, you get these new businesses that are often hybrids of other businesses, and they have to decide which schema to use or apply. And it's not going to be the same for them as it is for other businesses that might be more mainstream or known about.
Yeah, I think they've recognized that because they've changed the extension mechanism, where they had like their sort of hosted schemas.
Yeah,
like the auto, the bibliographic, the ones that you mentioned, and then there's the externally hosted one, the GS1, and which has a lot more of the product information. But it seemed like that was a barrier to like adoption more than it was helping, and so like they've ended up combining those extensions, those hosted extensions into the main, to kind of like just make it like sort of one vocabulary, with the exception of the attic, which is kind of like where things go to die, and then there's the pending one where things are being born, essentially. And like I like that. It's simpler, I guess, for people like if they're in the bibliographic, but it's still like there's no harm either in like extending the vocabulary with your own things, and if you can come up with if you have things that are important to your business, like an insurance company, for example, is kind of like a missing part of the vocabulary. You just need like some to flesh out the details of what an insurance product might look like, or what does an insurance thing look like. But they're happy if you have a suggestion to bring that into the vocabulary. But you have to kind of like roll up your sleeves and to try to like extend the vocabulary.
Yeah, some of the discussions on the mailing list roll into that, because you see people who's very have very fixed opinions about what schema should apply to their business, and other people don't buy into it too easily sometimes.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah, technology company bugs is sort of one area that I think's missing, is one that we sort of identified. I grew up at Cisco, right, in technical support. So that's one that we sort of like, there's tech article and they talk about this, but like, bug is a very real thing in like the software world. And so, as you talk about software companies, like where does that fit in?
Speaking of gaps, there's no life in schema. Like there's no animal concept. There's a person. But like, if you have any sort of creature that's not that's alive, there's no place for it. There's lots of them. Not to say that there's a big vocabulary or like a lot of content that supports it, but like if you're like, oh, I have a zoo and I have like a bear in the zoo, you can't describe it.
Really?
I'm actually touching on that in one of my next webinars. I'm going to use the moose as an example.
So I guess you couldn't use thing for that, could you?
No, you do.
You're right.
Yeah.
That's the kind of the workaround for it. Yeah.
Oh, okay. That's good to know.
Yeah, you could use an additional type of using the Wikipedia or the Google kind of knowledge identifier for it.
Right.
But
right.
like you can start with thing and say like, well, actually, if you want more information, go look at this other identifier for it, this other class.
Right. That would be in the about.
You could just use the type. So you could just say like it's a type of thing and it's a type of moose.
The moose type.
So that's kind of where you showed in one of the examples I saw on your site, where it had address company and it linked to a page on a website with a hash sign and country.
That's right. Yeah. Well, and this is again where Mark was saying like the vocabulary is very flexible, right? Like you can put text and URLs and lots of different things. And so if you're defining something as a type, like a Wikidata, reference is a good way to kind of describe a moose as a moose as a moose.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting. One of the common problems that I hear from people that are doing product offer is when there's variance in the products. You had a really good article with 3 different ways to tackle that. Would you like to talk a bit about that?
Well, man, you got to get Mark to go back in the time machine. I think you wrote that in 2016.
Well, it's still pretty, pretty.
It's very relevant. Yep.
Yeah, there's a couple of different ways you can do products, right? Like products are not always just a product. If you think of an Apple iPhone, it might have different memory capacities, and an Apple iPhone might come in different colors. And so like a product is not always like the same product. Like there's variations of it. And depending on which e-commerce platform you're in, like the terminology might be different. It might be a variant. It might be some other kind of concept. But to kind of like provide all of that information, there's sort of 3 different ways. One is having like an aggregate product offer. So you can say like there's a concept of aggregate offer, which just says like the price for the iPhone starts at $900 and goes up to $1,400. And you just say like there's a low price, high price. And that's like, that's a simple way to kind of say that there's like a bunch of products here. further than that, like you can then mark up each variant as an individual offer. So that means to say, like, there's the iPhone. I'm not an iPhone owner, but so I'll be making up. I'll say the iPhone 97, which I know we're not there yet, but the 97 blue could be its own offer, and it's $950. And iPhone 97 with like 512 gigabytes of memory is $1,300. And so you can just put the name of whatever the variant is in the name of the offer. It's kind of just not ideal though yet. I think the last one is the best way to do it, which is building on Martin Hepp's kind of ontology for doing product schema markup, which is, so you kind of have like this concept of a product, and each of those variations has its own product model, and then that product model is like a SKU in your business, and then you want to say all the common properties for the whole product, the main product, is put into the top concept, and then the things that are overriding and different about the variation go into the product model. And so, like, maybe its price is different, maybe its color is different, and the product model is really like the ideal one you want to provide, because it has the kind of the clear information to say, like, which ones are in stock, which ones are not in stock, the price of those things. Because if if someone Googles specifically for that version of the iPhone, then they'll be able to know exactly the answer, as opposed to saying, well, it may or may not be in stock. It's just in this range of offers. And it's more of just a limitation of, like, do you have the data available to produce that more complex one with all the information? I would start there. If you don't have all the data, then you kind of back up to like the simpler version. And sometimes we just have like the aggregate offer, because maybe they don't even want to publish all the offers in their locations, and so like that's kind of like the shorthand to kind of get there. There's more information on that on one of the blog posts on our website.
Yeah,
kind of like walk through.
I've put it in the discussion area, and I'll definitely include it in the article that accompanies the post, the video.
Right.
I guess running out of time. Yeah. So I guess that's the end of it.
Okay.
And that's the end of the hour's over.
Yeah, I had lots more questions for you, but we covered quite a bit today. I'll probably check in with you on the questions that I sent you, and it'll all be included in the post, because I think there is some excellent information on your website that is
Yeah, we're
really
happy to
useful.
share those resources. Amazing. Well, thanks for having us. One of our values of Schema App is around like teaching and learning. So we're always loving to get sort of beyond the basics. If you're really interested in doing this properly in a semantic way, check out the site at www.schemaapp.com.
Well, appreciate you both being here. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Our pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Bye now.
Okay. Bye for now.